It's an old, wise Polish tradition to set an extra plate, utensils, and a whole setting for a stranger who might stop by unannounced on Christmas Eve for Wigilia.
Kiedy już siwy i stary rok gubi na drzewach szron.
It has never happened in my 31-year-old existence, but there's always the possibility.
W wannie już pływa świąteczny.
It's a yearly practice that I have kept even in my own adult Christmas traditions, when celebrating with family or alone.
Spotkanie z Mikołajem miał.
It reminds me that for some, the holidays are a time of celebration, while for others, this time of year feels like Santa's delivering an extra heavy sack of coal.
Tak cicho spływa w dół.
I am fortunate to be spending another year under the tree with family, knowing there was a time I only dreamed to have this moment again.
Mamo, spójrz na świat.
Jak z bajki cały jest.
Whatever your burden this holiday season, hang on. Hang in there. You are seen, you are loved, and you are worthy. And if you're in the neighborhood, stop by and be that stranger.
We are all looking for adventure. We are all looking for adventure. We are all looking for...
Hey everyone, I'm Paulina Butska, your host. You are listening and watching, and that's okay. Today we are joined by Zach Miners, and Zach and I met in Louisville, Kentucky when I was reporting on a story about the LGBTQ Chamber of Commerce that was coming out in Louisville, Kentucky. Zach, I had no clue that at the time you were also related to our director at HAS. We clicked right away. You have this incredible story, a coming out story. And so today's episode, I really asked you on here because I wanted to talk about your coming out story. I think anybody in the LGBTQ community has one, and some are better than others, and some are more traumatic than others. And yours, mine, I think different levels of trauma, but somewhere there, they weren't very pleasant when we came out. So today's episode, I am gay and that's okay. Let's talk a little bit about how you came out.
So I was actually outed when I was around 14. It wasn't necessarily my choice or on my own terms, but it just kind of happened. I was in a very non-affirming world at that time. I grew up in a very conservative Christian home. We attended a fairly large non-denominational church. I volunteered there. My dad was a deacon. We were very involved. After being outed, it was very quickly, I already knew how my family would respond, and not just my family, but my whole community. Everyone that I knew, I didn't have any LGBTQ role models. And so for me, it was a pretty scary process. I was taken in to see a pastor at our church, and who was a licensed therapist. And that person then recommended me to go see someone who was not licensed, but who could help the situation, who could help fix me, who could help make me straight. And that was, I didn't really know what the term conversion therapy was at the time, but that was what it was. And that was where I ended up.
As somebody who had come out very late in life, I was introduced to the LGBTQ community in a very different way. And I did not have that experience as you did. I did not know about conversion therapy until we met, and then we started talking and kind of bonding over this. And we had done multiple stories when I was in Louisville about this, and I think conversion therapy, the trauma that you experienced there has now kind of molded your life plan and goal, I think. So let's talk about what conversion therapy is for anybody out there who is listening.
Conversion therapy is any attempt to change one's sexual or gender identity through spiritual or psychological interventions. So it can take many forms. It was a practice that kind of started back in the early world of psychotherapy, and then gained momentum when the AIDS epidemic began, because a lot of people didn't want to be gay because they were afraid of dying. And so the church, while it began kind of in psychotherapy, the church began kind of adopting a lot of the measures and then, being a big proponent of it throughout the 70s, 80s, and then all the way up through to today. It started, into the early 1900s, but really seriously took off, I would say, in like the 50s. It began where they used to give people insulin, trying to get people basically on the verge of dying and then bringing them back into this very euphoric state. And the idea was that you would be reborn and then your sexual identity would change. Later in the 60s, they began using forms of aversion therapy. So electricity, ice, heat, showing people some form of stimuli and then inflicting some sort of physical pain. The idea there being that the more you begin to have negative associations with those images that you would normally be attracted to. And so it would begin to, quote unquote, reorient the brain. And then going into today, there are still practices that utilize some of those same ideas, and so not necessarily electricity, but more electroshock. That does still happen, but it's pretty rare at this point. But, other types of pain, and then also just being in these very shame-inducing one-on-one therapy sessions that are not therapy. They aren't licensed therapists, therapists manipulating and controlling their patients, if you want to call them that. It's been widely denounced by every major medical and psychological association as being harmful. It's shown through the data that we have that, high rates of suicide, depression, PTSD, anxiety, depression, all are part of it.
Let's talk a little bit about what your experience in conversion therapy is, because I want to make that clear that you did go through conversion therapy and you went through it for quite a few years. And like I said, before we get into kind of how that shaped your life and the journey that you're on right now, let's take you back into that moment of kind of going in, getting outed, and then being placed in conversion therapy and kind of what the practices there were. Where were you mentally, physically, emotionally?
I think when you're 14, you're kind of in a state of, you're in a very much figuring out what the world is like, and you're looking to the people who are your role models as to what the right thing to say or do is. And so, I didn't have any LGBTQ role models, and so therefore I had no idea that even being out and gay was even an option, much less okay. As we're talking about on today's podcast. So, it was just something I had no concept for. So when this idea was introduced that, hey, you have this problem, and it is a problem, but it's fixable. And if you trust these people and trust these adults, we can begin to fix you. And once this is fixed, you can be right before God, and you can, go on and have a happy, productive, straight male life. So that was how it began. I met this guy down in this kind of old church, and actually a fairly progressive part of town in Louisville, which is kind of interesting now because it's where a lot of the gay bars are. But
The irony.
Yeah, for sure. But now at the time, I was going there in the beginning twice a week, and then as time went along, once a week. I went for 4 years. It was something that was, it was a lot of these one-on-one sessions, but it all kind of blends together in my mind, as this kind of one long session. This was someone who was a quote-unquote former homosexual and had come out of the LGBTQ lifestyles. A lot of the things that he would have me do would be to confess. We'd talk about how my sexual sobriety was going, talk about any fantasies or thoughts or dreams that I had. And he would want me to describe them in very, very vivid detail. Over time, it began to make me very uncomfortable because it felt like I was almost sharing these erotic stories with someone who was getting enjoyment out of them. And when I went and talked to, my other pastors and another licensed therapist that I was seeing, I was just told that I was the one getting treatment, not him. He was someone who could be trusted. He was a pastor, and I just needed to trust the process. It didn't matter that he was getting boners in our sessions or that, he was fucking with my brain. That was just part of the process I needed to trust. So again, I was a part of a belief system and a structure and a power structure that very much kept me there.
That's 4 years of a very crucial time in your life when you're developing, when, really most of us are exploring with our sexuality. We are still trying to figure out who we are, even we're trying to maneuver our teen years, right? Those are years that are shitty to begin with for most people. You're kind of growing into who you are, your body, and your own being, and to be exposed to something so traumatic, and I want to almost say that borders on predatory.
It is predatory.
It is predatory. I think that, how did that impact you moving forward?
Well, I stayed in that world even after coming out of it after 4 years. I stayed in that world for a very long time. I went to a Christian university. I was still very much trying to keep my, sexual deviance under control and under wraps. I went to a variety of Exodus International conferences. Exodus International was a large ex-gay organization, conversion therapy network that had, hands all over the world. In, I believe, 2013 was the year that they closed down. Alan Chambers, the executive director at the time, apologized for the harm they had caused and said that conversion therapy did not work, that he was shutting the organization down. There were all these conversion therapists that were operating kind of under the umbrella of Exodus at the time. And so really what began to happen was it almost cut the link that was connecting all of them, and then it all went underground. So in 2013, it kind of went from being this visible network to this very underground network, which makes it a lot harder to track and monitor now. But, according to the Williams Institute, 698,000 LGBT adults in the US have received conversion therapy at some point in their lives. 350,000 of those received it as adolescents, and 16,000 youth will receive therapy within the next 3 years in states of the US that do not currently ban the practice for minors. So yeah, it's a big issue.
What was that moment for you when you found out that they were going under, that, they said conversion therapy does not work? At that moment, did you think it was working for you? I mean, were you not gay at some point? I think I'm trying to understand that part.
I think I would have said that I still struggled with homosexuality, quote unquote, take on again, I'm using this term in quotes, but, gay identity or the gay lifestyle. That part was a choice, not necessarily the thoughts or impulses that you have. Again, I think it's all bullshit now, but at the time that would have been, what I believed. And so it was kind of disheartening because I thought that the conversion therapy didn't work for me, but I thought, well, maybe just my therapist was bad. Maybe I'm a bad person. I don't know. There were a lot of things at that point. It wasn't until 2016, I was initially out of conversion therapy in 2008, and then was still involved in ex-gay ministry pretty heavily through 2012. And so it wasn't even, 4 years after that before I finally began to come out and, live my truth in my life without, them fucking with it.
The word that comes up to me as you speak is almost shame.
So much shame.
Shame is something that the more that we talk about the LGBTQ community and the more we talk about these coming out stories, I think shame is something that so many of us end up dealing with. For you, it was this shame and people trying to tell you in therapy by people who you trusted and your parents trusted, that you should be ashamed of who you are. I remember when I came out, I had specifically a very good friend of my mom's who she would call me daily, and she was very religious, and she would try to shame me into saying, you are not this way, you can't be this way. And so I had a long time and a long journey to kind of figuring out, where do I stand on the spectrum in the community, right? Like, am I a lesbian? Am I bi? And what, am I queer? What is the identity that I want to take on? And I went through that much later in life as a woman, not as a child, right? And so talk to me about
shame was built into that, right?
Right. Like that shame was there. Like, even as an adult, I had this moment of shame. My mother wasn't talking to me when I came out to her, right? Like there was that shame. There was the shame of I'm on TV, I'm living in the South. And I had nasty comments of people and viewers writing in, oh, the lesbian, oh, this, oh, you should be ashamed, oh, God's gonna come after you. So navigating through that as an adult, that was hard. What was it like navigating kind of this young adulthood that these teen years that you were exposed to, where all the shame was brought on you, and then you're kind of internally dealing with that, going into your adulthood where you kind of almost have to unlearn all of that? What was that process of kind of unlearning that shame?
I mean, it's still a process. It's still something that I don't think I've, fully, it's not like I've arrived, because that is so much deep seated shit that's just kind of caked on you, and it affects you in ways in which a lot of people don't even realize. I mean, when I was younger, 5 or 6 years old, a lot of times it'd be like, oh, I love to dance and perform and sing. And then around 13, 14, 15, 16 years old was the time when I quote unquote became an introvert. But people don't become introverts. Like that's something that was brought onto you by shame and guilt. And again, I think it's important to recognize that it wasn't just my conversion therapist. It wasn't, my parents. I had a very loving home. My parents loved me. But they were told that this was what you need to do. It's what I was told that this is what I needed to do. All of my friends at the time, all of their friends at the time, were all very much saying, yeah, do this. This is what you got to do. This is what you got to do to be healthy. The idea that there's some sort of trauma. And I think a lot of people don't realize that, my parents were also going to see my conversion therapist at the time, through sessions with him as well. And a lot of it was told oh, well, you just didn't throw football in the backyard with him enough growing up, or you didn't do this or that. So there was a lot of shame also put onto my parents, and not just my parents, but the parents of kids that are in these practices. We talk about survivors of this practice, but there also really are victims, and it's hard to ever know who those victims are because, again, there's so much shame surrounding them. So it's not like the families are going to come out and say, oh, my kid was in conversion therapy and then committed suicide. You're not going to get those statistics. So we'll never really know. It's horrible and it's very sad. And the only way we're going to be able to stop it is by more people telling their stories and more people, realizing that there is a different side to this issue. Because I think even if a kid is going into conversion therapy in today's world, if you're in a fairly liberal environment, at least those kids have some sort of LGBT role models where maybe they can see the cracks in the system sooner. Whereas in 2004, when I was first starting into the practice, there wasn't, I didn't have a huge, online network, or, social media was not as popular then. And so, it was just a different world. But, in a lot of parts of the world, this is still going on. Conversion therapy is still happening in every state in the US, even states where it's quote unquote banned, because it's still a religious practice. It's protected under the First Amendment as a religious right for a religious practitioner to do. And so even as these laws unfold, the conversion therapy bans, which are important, but I think a lot of people think, oh, well, conversion therapy doesn't happen anymore because of those laws. And that's not true. It happens in every state. And as a matter of fact, due to COVID and due to the pandemic, it's actually really helped a lot of these organizations, because now online counseling and therapy is more of a thing. So it's become even more underground, and they're using, just like quote unquote normal therapists, licensed therapists that are not doing this practice. These charlatans are going on Zoom, going online, and growing their networks and
coming straight to the house this time. Yeah.
Right.
So, Zach, one of the things that comes to mind as you speak is this relationship that you had with your parents that kind of, I think, emerged from this. I know that when we had done, in particular, one of the bigger stories on conversion therapy in Kentucky, and you had shared your story for the news station. We had spoken the next day about the positive feedback that you got and kind of how it opened, I guess, a doorway and a path, a different conversation between you and your family after seeing a lot of that story out there. So let's talk a little bit about the relationship that you have with your parents right now, because I think that is another, family is such a big, it's such a big part of our lives, and so especially in the LGBTQ community, many times when kids come out or adults come out, they do get shunned, they get excommunicated, and they just kind of get kicked out of the family. And that was not the case for you, but you had other obstacles that you kind of had to patch up with your family moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, my parents, like I said, they have always loved me and have always wanted what's best for me. It wasn't until about 2019 that I had a conversation with my parents, and my dad really apologized for the first time for sending me to conversion therapy. And, there's no doubt in my mind that if they knew then what they know now, I wouldn't have been in conversion therapy. But, again, it wasn't just conversion therapy. It was growing up in that very toxic environment. And, I also have a gay brother. And so, it's like, I think my parents have had to be on their own journey, and, it's a journey that none of us have arrived at. We're all still kind of on that journey. So, my parents, I think, really have come a long way. That I think they, but like I said, there's room for growth all the way around. But my parents are still very, in the conservative Christian world. A big part of it was just like their friends and the circle of people that they're in with. It's like homosexuality is still not accepted, and so I think having two gay kids, they really have had to, kind of go through the ringer a little bit with that. So, that's kind of their journey and their story. That's for them to tell when and if they want to.
Sure.
But, I do know that my parents always loved me, and that, we've done a lot of work to try to repair that relationship as best we can.
And I want to highlight something too, because in my own journey, I know that I fell off with my mom for about a good 2 years. We did not speak when I came out. And that was one of the things that you and I had talked about when we first met. I When I moved to Kentucky, my mom and I were not talking. And so I felt very alone navigating through being openly gay, being in an abusive relationship, being in so many different scenarios that I found myself in. And, we're on the other side of that right now. My mom and I are speaking, where we have a great relationship. And growing up, I had a great relationship with her. And I know that when my mom had joined the church after my father had passed, that was such a blessing for her, because I think it helped her with her grief and her the emotions that she was going through. But it did not help her, and when she was navigating through my coming out. And I think that rings true for so many people out there listening and who are going through this as well. It is a journey. It's a journey for you. It's a journey for me. And it's a journey for our parents as well, to kind of come to that moment where my mom too later came to me and apologized, and that conversation was had, but that damage was there. And so that is something that I'm still working through with a therapist, with myself, and with my mom. Moving forward, it's like, how do we move? How do we move forward?
Dan Savage always says, like, the best, the biggest power we have over our families is our presence. And so I think that, if you are in a toxic relationship with your parents, I think the best thing that you can do is just to kind of remove yourself, because it will be a very toxic relationship. I mean, I think pretty much, obviously there are some really, really bad parents out there, but for the most part, I think parents always want what's best for us as kids. I think the disagreements come in on what they think is best for you versus what you think is best for, so and so if you're in a toxic relationship, I think the best thing you can do is just to kind of take a step back and give it time. And that really kind of puts the control back on you as the child, the son, the daughter, the
Sure.
non-binary child. It's a way of you reclaiming your power in that relationship, because then, I think most parents want to have a relationship with their kids. So once some time has passed, I think, when you come out, you have to kind of let your parents freak out, because they probably will. And, I just think you kind of have to set a period of time to kind of allow them to freak out, whether that's 6 months or a year, whatever it is. And then if they're still being toxic, if they're still sending you those articles, if they're still constantly bringing it up, then that's where you have to kind of draw a line in the sand and say, look, this is me and this is who I am. You can either accept that or not, but this is happening with or without you. And if you don't want to be a part of my life, that's your choice. And really kind of putting it back on them that either you're going to accept me or you're not. And so I think, getting to that place is very challenging, and it's easier said than done, but I think it's important.
I think you said it best. It's challenging, but it is important. And I think, eventually, I know that for myself, that light looked so bleak at the end of the tunnel when the one thing that I will credit my ex-wife for was the fact that, she would be the one to say to me, your mom will come around, your mom will come around. And I didn't believe it. I grew up in a very liberal household. I grew up seeing many things and having very different friends and seeing a cycle of people that I thought I was very well adapted to. And so I did not expect the kind of reaction I got from my mom when this all happened and when I came out. And I think that
How old were you when you came out?
28.
Yeah.
28.
I was 26, so I wasn't that much younger when I came out fully.
Holy, yeah.
When I was outed.
But so, and I think that that's really interesting too, because you've had this journey of you were outed at first, and then you didn't officially come out when you were comfortable saying that you're gay, right? And that's okay, until 26. Like, it is a journey. It's such a journey to kind of figure out who you are, what you want to do, and how you want to explore that side of you, right? Like, that's the thing, that it really takes time for everybody. And so I think grace is the word that comes up to mind, is just have a little grace with yourself to move forward in that. With all that being said, Zach, you have done some spectacular things with the trauma that you have been through in conversion therapy. And I say spectacular because you really made it your life mission to educate the public about conversion therapy. Let's talk a little bit about the project that you have going on right now.
So I came out in 2016, kind of back on my own terms and on my own conditions. But in 2018, I found out from a family member that someone I knew growing up was in conversion therapy, and not just in conversion therapy, but was seeing my old former conversion therapist. And so I knew he was a creep, and I was like, how is this guy still practicing 10 years later? I came out in 2008, now it's 2018. How is this guy still in business? And it really is a business. These people, this is how they make their income. And I made a video, just the goal of it was really just to out my former conversion therapist. But a few mentors and people in my life encouraged me to dream bigger. And so then we were going to make a 20 to 30 minute short film. And then that has turned into a full length feature documentary that'll be coming out likely in 2022 called Conversion. You can go to conversionmovie.com to find out more information about it.
Amazingly, conversion therapy is still going on.
It's still alive and well and everywhere.
It became a much larger project. It began the process of me going and traveling the country and meeting survivors from around the world. And, really, it's just a mission of telling the story of survivals. It is a survival story. And also, shining light on the victims and, really just helping people's stories get out there and, educate the public. This is still going on. Like I said, I think the bans are important, but I also think public education is very important.
1000%.
And
I didn't know anything about it until you educated me, and then I started doing my own work on it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very troubling. This is something that, you just have so many kids who, are being, their lives are being put at danger, and that's not something you want to risk someone's life with. It's important. I think it's important to educate the parents, but I think it's also good for aunts, uncles, cousins, friends to be able to see and know more about it, because the warning signs will be there. And so I think, if you think like, oh, my nephew, he's 10, he's probably gay. And then 12, 13 years old, someone sees that, oh, their behavior is really starting to change, and they're, going away to a summer camp every year, or they're doing this, or there are warning signs that are there that, people can begin to ask the right questions, and then, hopefully get that child out of that situation.
One of the people that you met on your journey, other than survivors, was the person who literally wrote the handbook on conversion therapy. Let's talk a little bit about that experience, because this person has now made millions off of this. They wrote a book, and has been heavily publicized, and kind of social media went crazy about this, but that bothers me to a great deal, knowing that this person has so much blood on their hands.
It's really a bigger part of a bigger issue, right? Because a lot of these conversion therapists are coming out now saying that it's bullshit, which is great. Great. Glad to hear that. Glad that you finally admit that your entire life's career was a fraud, and that what you're doing is killing people. The person I think you're referring to, McCrae Game, I don't think he's made millions of dollars off of it. It was his livelihood for a long time. He has had, a book and, video series, developed an app. They had conferences all around the world, and they did all these things. He, came out in 2018, I believe, and then in 2019 was when he more publicly came out about his experience. But even, there's a film on Netflix right now, Pray Away, and it only highlights, for the most part, former conversion therapists, which I think is an interesting perspective. But from my point of view, it's handing the wrong people the mic, because these are the people who harmed people. These are the people who caused suicides, who destroyed lives, who ripped apart families. And now they're, becoming famous, getting book deals, and, going on public speaking tours, and, giving TED Talks, or, whatever. And to me, it's just handing the wrong people the mic, because at the end of the day, who better to tell the story than survivors?
What was one of the things that you learned on this journey as you started speaking to other survivors, or was there something that you learned in this process?
I've met a pretty diverse group of survivors, and there's way more diversity out there. Now I think gay and lesbian rights have come a long way. We have gay marriage, we have things like that. Now it's really beginning to crack down on trans rights, and we really have to fight for our trans brothers, sisters, non-binary. We have to fight for them, because now they're really, I think, getting the brunt of it, especially from the legislative side. But there also are states that are passing, I think Florida and a few other states right now are working on passing bans on the ban of conversion therapy. So basically putting laws into place that would prevent a ban from ever stopping, a ban from ever being there. It is important what we're doing. And, I think now, when you look at in terms of percentage of the population, I think back, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, this was a very white, cis, male issue, the issue of conversion therapy. For the most part, those were the people. Obviously, there were survivors of all backgrounds, but that was the majority, based on the knowledge and research that I've seen, at least, that seem to be the people who underwent conversion therapy. Now we're beginning to see more and more people of color. Actually, the largest population percentage-wise that are currently in conversion therapy are Indigenous people. I think it's beginning to be more of an issue for women, for trans people. I think the church has a long history of just kind of ignoring women's sexuality in general, and not really thinking, it's just oh, they're just being silly. And there was never really the idea of putting women's pleasure or relationship, even what a woman thinks, the church has historically not really given a shit about. So I think now, we have to shine a light on that too. There's just a lot of misogyny, a lot of racism, and a lot of, classism that is a part of this as well.
Let's talk a little bit about religion in general and kind of the role that it plays in your life. I openly on this podcast talk about my own spiritual journey, which has been kind of a roller coaster and everywhere. When I was living in Louisiana, I was heavily involved in the church. I think it helped me through certain parts of my grief and the trauma that I was dealing with. But when I did come out, that was one of the things and the problems that I encountered, was that a lot of the people and the friends that I made, had something to say, and it was not very nice, and it was not it's not something that I should ever be repeating. Let's put it that way. I mean,
Right.
it very much was, you're going against God's will. And I continued to go to church for a long time after I came out, and I left for other reasons. I still have friends in the church. Some of them are on this podcast, and I don't hold a grudge against religion or against the institution. And I think that my journey, for the most part, my religious journey is my own, and I believe in a higher power. But I think it's different for everybody, right? Like, what has your journey been with religion, knowing that religion is really what spiraled you into this big depression, this lifelong journey?
For me, it's still a process I'm on. I kind of walked away from the church in 2016 after being, burned over and over and over again over a decade. And I walked away from it. I have not really formally in any way gone back to church, but I do have a chosen family, and I do have, I'm on my own spiritual journey, and that I'm still very much on, so I don't know where that will lead me, if it will eventually lead back to some form of a church setting or what. But, I think the important thing is that to recognize, I think the American church has strayed very far away from what Jesus and the Bible were about. I think that, for me, the biggest thing that really was the kind of straw that broke the camel's back in terms of walking away from the church was seeing how much the church clung to Trump and being like, oh, like you are this is your guy. Like, I was, this guy is against everything that I thought you all were about when I was growing up. And I was so bought into the system. I think it's important to recognize that while, the American Christian church is very fucked up in so many ways, homophobia, racism, misogyny, transphobia, all those things are not just an American Christian church issue. Those exist across a lot of religions, and even people who aren't religious. Those are the things we're fighting against. And so I think, the biggest way that I know how to fight it is by, telling my story and encouraging other people to tell their stories.
I believed them. I believed in the lie.
Like, if you have problems, that's why. The problem is you.
And, again, to stand up for, Black lives, trans lives, all those types of, just standing up for the minorities, and not just our country, but around the world, as we're, seeing so many oppressed groups of people. And, that's all I know how to do. And as a filmmaker, that's what I'm at least attempting to do at doing, even if not super well all the time, but that's the goal.
I think you do a phenomenal job, and I hope everybody goes out there and watches your documentary. And I hope that, I'm wishing you the best of luck on that entire journey, because I have seen the beginning stages of this, the infant stages of it, and to see it come to fruition and know just how far you are in this process, and just you're right there. I cannot wait. So Zach, so much, my hat is off to you for really speaking about this and being so raw and open with the viewers and the listeners about your own journey. Is there anything else that you wanted to add for anybody out there who may be listening, who may be watching, who's going through something, whether it's conversion therapy, coming out to your family?
I think no matter what type of background you come from, I think just learning to accept and love yourself is important. Not that we're not also trying to grow as humans and evolve. That's, part of the human experience as well. But just beginning to love and accept yourself, and to find the people who do encourage you and help you grow and do help you be the person you want to be, surrounding yourself by those people, by finding your chosen family, by, really leaning into that. Like, it is really, really hard, but it's worth it. Being able to be who you are is worth it. And being gay is okay.
It is. It is. I think that's the bottom line, right? It's a journey, and it's an acceptance journey, that's for sure. And it's that acceptance, it touches so many people around you, right? But it is an acceptance journey, and being gay is absolutely okay. Zach Miners, everyone. Zach, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Challenge draw me in, 'cause I want more.